Welcome everyone. This is the second episode we're doing in the Objectivism Brasil new podcast interview format. Our goal is to invite English speakers to talk about, within Objectivism, to talk about their experiences with Objectivism, how it impacted their work, and their particular expertise in the areas that they work with. So today we're talking with Don Watkins, who within Objectivism doesn't really need an introduction. He co-authored a number of books with Yaron Brook. He wrote a few books by himself, recently a novel, and he worked at ARI for a few years and is now back at ARI. So with no further delay, welcome Don, and we appreciate you coming.
Really good to be here. Thanks for having me on.
So the first question I would like to ask you, so you went through the OAC in the early versions of it in the early 2000s. And what was your experience going through the program at that time?
So you're asking about the Objectivist Academics Center, which is now being kind of placed within a wider program, Ayn Rand University, which I think we might get to talking about. But essentially, it's the Ayn Rand Institute's training program in Objectivism. And, I discovered Objectivism when I was 15 years old. And at that time, there wasn't really a program for people my age, but it still took me a number of years, I think 4 or 5 at least, until I joined the OAC. And the reason was I felt that it was better to just learn everything on my own. And I thought, wow, if I'm taking classes, I'm somehow going to stifle my originality, or I don't need this, something like that. And then I don't remember exactly what changed, but at a certain point I realized, you know what, every successful person in every sphere and every innovator, they rely on having really great teachers, and they rely on having really excellent mentors. And so it seems insane that I'm not taking advantage of the fact that there's people whose whole profession is to help others understand Objectivism. And so, there's a lot I could say about that experience, but I'll just name one thing, which is it is really hard to identify your own blind spots. It's really hard to identify, these are the things I'm doing wrong, or these things that I don't know, without the help of somebody who can see more than you and that kind of feedback that you get from them. And that was probably the most valuable thing about the OAC, is that I became really clear on where are my blind spots, where do I have to put in work in order to know more. And so just as an example of that, one of the things was I was not always clear on, okay, when do I really understand an idea in a first-handed way? And when am I just really good at remembering what Ayn Rand said, or what Leonard Peikoff said, or what Yaron Brook said? And what the OAC did was teach a certain way of asking philosophic questions that help you identify when you get something and when you don't. And that very act of questioning then is going to be instrumental in you reaching a kind of firsthand understanding of issues. And so I think the kind of universal thing is just giving you that kind of feedback from experts that you can't replace it with just reading and watching lectures. That's great. That's amazing. And you can get a lot from reading and watching lectures online. But it's that personalized instruction and feedback that I think really made the difference in my development and was the unique value of going through that program.
So at the time, this is about 20 years ago, what was the mode of the course? Did you all go in person? Because the internet wasn't the same as it is today. So how did that happen?
The first class I was in, I think, was mainly you would phone in, and it was a phone conference, and I think it was like that for a while. But then I moved to California to join the Ayn Rand Institute, and at that time they had a hybrid of in-person and then by phone. So it has certainly changed now to a kind of seamless video interaction on class, and I think that is vastly superior. There's a lot that's good about attending in person, but the fact that we have such an improved way to interact and learn ideas remotely, I think that's great because very few students have the ability to go, live in person in Southern California. And indeed, Ankar Gate and some of the other teachers aren't in Southern California anymore. So we had to, have a solution for that.
Yeah, and again, out of curiosity, I mean, nowadays, whenever we write papers and assignments and so on, it's just online. We have the Moodle platform. But at the time, uh, did you fax your papers? What was the mode?
No, at that point, I think it was,
Email already?
yeah, it was definitely email by then. And eventually we had some sort of platform where you'd post things. So like not the complete dark ages, but, I mean, the ARI had done training, back into the 80s, and there was a period where, yeah, you'd have to like fax or like mail something or um, uh, unimaginable hurdles that one would have to do in order to learn ideas at that time.
Yeah. So after getting into the, let's say, sphere of ARI and then going through the OAC, you began working there as a young intellectual. So what was your training like working at ARI?
So my view of intellectual training is that it's actually super straightforward in that basically it's you do the activities that being an intellectual consists of, and then you get feedback. So that's, learning how to read and think through um, intellectual texts, including philosophic texts, and then writing, speaking, debating, and getting feedback. And so, I mean, basically, that's what my job consisted of is that for 11 years, every day I got to spend all of my workday writing, speaking, reading, thinking, and then getting feedback from people like Ankar Gate and Keith Lockitch and Yaron Brook and Alon Journo. And it like that was the process that over time, like you can't help but improve. Um, your peak, might be lower than you'd like, but you'll hit like a really high level of achievement if you're in a situation where you're able to do that. And it's, so it's an unparalleled opportunity if you can get yourself in a position like that. And if you can't, I mean, that's in effect what Ayn Rand University or the Objectivist Academic Center give you kind of the taste of, right? They give you a partial ability to do that, even if you can't spend 40 hours a week doing it.
Yeah. So do you remember a time when when you first started getting this training in the first few years? I mean, a lot of it is you realizing that you can't write or you can't think properly, and it's a lot of jabs coming from Keith and so on. So was there a point where you realized that, let's say, you became good, that now you could properly produce an article, you could properly write a speech, and even though people will still give you feedback and so on, but it was more like now I can do this kind of stuff. Did you have that kind of moment or point?
There's a book, and I think it's called Mastery, but it's not the book I usually recommend by Robert Greene. But the guy looks at like every kind of sphere in which people try to develop mastery over something, whether it's martial arts or in their career, and notes that there's kind of this process of you improve and then you plateau and you improve and then you plateau, and that the plateaus can be really hard because you feel like you're just doing the same thing, making the same mistakes, not making progress. And that's where most people give up. They'll get some, and usually this happens at the beginning, right? As a beginner, you learn a whole bunch of stuff and you make a bunch of improvements, and then you hit this plateau and it feels like, all right, well, now it got really hard and I quit. And I definitely had something very similar. I came into the Institute having studied Ayn Rand on my own for 10 years, having written about her ideas basically every day on, first it was online message boards, and then once blogs became a thing on my blogs. And so, I thought it was at a pretty high level. And the first striking thing was when I got to the Institute realizing, and now I had really just started the OAC at this time. I had taken the writing course, but had not really gotten in deep with the philosophy. And so when I got there and met the people and started getting feedback on my work, it was really earth shattering to realize, oh my gosh, I am so far from what's required in order to do this job. And that was both like terrifying and but also exciting, right? Like the idea that there was this much to learn, I found really thrilling. But it took, and I don't have a great uh, line in the sand, but it took a few years before I even started to feel competent. I mean, I remember that first year sitting in my bed. I was trying to write my first op-ed for ARI. It was on the cigarette smoking bans in restaurants. And I just looked and I said, I don't know how to write. Like, and not like in some kind of like highfalutin sense, but like I don't even know how to make a paragraph. Like I just felt so utterly incapable. But after about 2 years, I was starting to get things approved. I was having important insights. But I would say it really wasn't until I finished my first book with Uran, Free Market Revolution, that I thought, all right, now I really am in control of my writing and I've developed my own personal style. And I still had a lot to learn and a lot to improve on. And indeed, I wouldn't, to the extent I've achieved any kind of mastery, I would really say that didn't happen until really the last 3 years fully. Uh, but it was really writing that first book where I thought, okay, like I've really figured out enough that like I know what I'm doing and I know what I put it in terms of I feel in control of my writing. And that's really how I think about the kind of line in the sand between amateur and professional, if you want to put it that way, is that, you know, an amateur can sometimes come out with great stuff. Sometimes it's a mess, but when they get into trouble, they don't know how to get out of it. And when they do something good, they don't know how they did it. And
Mhm.
a professional, I think, is somebody who can struggle. Like you can have all sorts of problems, but but you know why things are working and why they're not. And you can diagnose your own difficulties in a way that that takes a long time to build up to and achieve.
Right. So how did your intellectual training influence your work later on? So after you left ARI, and how do you think it made you more productive?
Well, I mean, those are kind of two different questions. On the first one, I'll just say briefly, I mean, look, what I was learning was how to think philosophically and how to communicate effectively. And those are kind of those are of fundamental value in life and certainly fundamental value in a career. But then if you put it in terms of productivity, so it's like, what is productivity? Now, mainly when people talk about productivity and you buy books on productivity, it's often a focus on efficiency. It's like, oh, I found this hack that will shave off 5 minutes from email, and now I'm more productive. And that's true in a trivial way, but productivity is really about how much value you can create. And essentially, what my training amounted to was the ability to create value as an intellectual. That's really what I was learning how to do. And now I say it gave me the ability. Um, the precondition for creating value as an intellectual is being able to think and communicate clearly. But that's not sufficient. So uh, after I left ARI, I spent 3 years working full time with somebody I had worked with first at ARI, Alex Epstein, who then went and created an organization called the Center for Industrial Progress that comments on energy and environmental issues. And most of your listeners probably know Alex as the author of The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels and a book that's going to come out in a few weeks, Fossil Future. And a big part of what I learned from Alex was, how do you combine that foundation of being able to think and communicate clearly with actually creating value to people in the market. And the key concept I'll use here actually comes not from Alex, but from Jeff Bezos of Amazon. And that is the idea of customer obsession. And it's the idea that creating value means that people in the market value what you're creating, and thinking deeply about how can I be helpful to them? How can I actually do something that is really valuable to them and that they see as valuable? And so if you think about in objectivism, um, there's a view that businessmen need a moral defense, but that does not really but if you try to start a business saying, I'm going to offer a moral defense to you businessmen, you'll get nowhere. And that's because you're not helping people in the way they want to be helped. Like, nobody in the energy industry, which is what I was doing for Alex, they weren't looking for a moral case for fossil fuels. What they were looking for is to stop getting beaten up by bad PR. They wanted their projects approved. They wanted to influence policy decisions. They wanted to improve their ability to recruit top talent. And what we discovered was that the moral case for fossil fuels was a great tool for helping them achieve those goals. And so the customer obsession was saying, what are they actually trying to achieve? What problems are they actually trying to solve? And then saying, okay, there's a way in which my ability to think and communicate clearly can help them achieve that. And there's an analogy in the marketing world that people don't buy drills, they buy holes, right? They want the result. They're not interested that much in the means to getting the result. And so it's seeing that our means as intellectuals has to actually give people a result that they want to achieve and are trying to achieve. And so that's kind of the pillars then I would say of like being an intellectual who's productive is be able to reach the truth, to communicate the truth. And part of that means communicate it persuasively, but then to do that in a way that actually solves the problems that people are trying to solve in the market.
Yeah, I see. I see. So just to shift gears a little bit and ask you a little bit of a slightly more philosophical question. So could you give us a brief overview of the virtues in objectivism?
Well, we should take a step back and say like why should we care about this idea of virtue in the first place? Like, why is that even something that people should be interested in? And my view is that the answer is it's not, excuse me, it's not obvious how to achieve success and happiness. Like, that is not at all obvious. And you can see that by the very fact that most people, even if they don't make a total mess of their lives, are not as happy and successful as they want to be. And so what the virtues are properly are they're causal principles. They're principles of cause and effect. They tell us the kind of causes to enact in order to achieve genuine values that lead to happiness. They're giving us a kind of like, they're breaking down a way of life that will actually lead to happiness. Now, it doesn't guarantee that you'll be happy, certainly not tomorrow. It guarantees that over the long run and barring accident, you'll be happy. And certainly by contrast, that if you violate these principles, you can't achieve success and happiness. Now, it's a complicated question of like how you identify and prove a virtue. Like, how do you identify and establish that that a way of acting, a way of living will lead to success and happiness? And objectivism has a very deep account of this. And to make a really long story short, essentially it is identifying or recognizing that our basic means of survival is reason. That there's this one activity that human beings engage with that underlies every other benefit that we can achieve and experience, and that is thinking, following reason. And so if that's true, then the basic virtue, the source of all the benefits that we could hope to achieve in life, come from being rational, following reason full time on every issue, every aspect of life without exception. And so you could put it as using reason as your only guide to knowledge and using reason as your only guide to values. Now, that's enormously abstract. If all I told you was, okay, be virtuous, be rational, that's not enough guidance. It's too general. And so Ayn Rand breaks down the virtue of rationality not into kind of different virtues, but into different aspects of what it means to be rational in different aspects of life. And she has 6, and she's not saying that these are the only virtues, but it's 6 ones that she thinks are key. And just very quickly, you have independence. So this is the idea of thinking for yourself and living by the work of your own mind. There's honesty, which is the refusal to fake reality. Integrity, which is the unity of thought and action. And justice, judging people rationally and granting to each person that which they deserve. Productiveness, which you can think of as taking responsibility for creating the values that you need to live. And then pride, which is achieving self-esteem through moral ambitiousness. And so that's kind of an overview, but you can see that they're all about being rational, but with a kind of more delimited focus in terms of what rationality would consist of in this aspect of life.
So why is it that if a man violates one of these virtues, he is in fact violating all of them? What is the, let's say, relationship between these virtues?
Well, that's not exactly right. I mean, in a certain way, from a certain perspective, it is, in the sense that if there's one virtue, rationality, and you're irrational, then you violated all the virtues. But I think the point you're thinking of is more that to consistently violate any virtue, you'd have to default on them all. That is, if you were really going to reject justice, ultimately that entails rejecting every other virtue. If you're going to reject productiveness, that's going to entail rejecting every other virtue. But I think that question often gets blended with the somewhat different question, because part of the objectivist view is there's really no such thing as a person who defaults on virtue consistently or becomes committed to, all right, I'm going to 100% of the time be a lying, cheating scoundrel, right? The whole essence of evil is to get away. It's to be what Ayn Rand called a hitchhiker on virtue. So it's, all right, yeah, I'll produce, and I want other people to produce. I'm not going to write treaties on why we should all not produce, and I'm not going to create a state that will make it illegal to create anything. It's, I want you guys to do it, and then I want to be able to make exceptions whenever it suits me. So, yeah, sometimes I'll go to work. Sometimes I'll swipe $20 if I see it lying around and so on. Or, yeah, well, I'll go to work, but I'm going to tax you and demand that, you support those who don't want to work. It's the attempt not to reject virtue consistently, but to be a kind of hitchhiker on it or make exceptions for it. And there's a lot to say on what's wrong with that and why that can't work. But I mean, the point I'll just say is this. The fundamental issue is that the whole thing that makes virtue is consistency. If the evil is trying to get away once in a while with something, then the good has to be consistent. It has to be, no, I'm going to be honest all the time on every issue. And, look, it is possible for a good person to fail at any given time. So and that's why I stress this idea of, it's not true that if you, reject one virtue, you rejected them all, in the sense of you make one bad decision and suddenly you're as bad as Hitler. That's not the point. The point is that you have to recommit yourself to, no, I'm going to be fully honest. I wasn't in this case. I'm going to own up to it. I'm not going to allow myself to benefit from it. So if I told a lie that allowed me to get a job, no, I'm not going to take that job. I'm going to recommit myself to adhering to reality. That kind of thing, like people do that. Like I've certainly, violated moral principles, and I try my best not to, but it's having a real commitment to being consistent, and that I think is what the whole essence of morality demands, because there's nothing to be gained from violating moral principles, because as we said, the whole essence of them is saying, like, no, this is what you have to do in order to achieve values in reality.
So why, I know this is psychologizing a little bit, but why do you think people choose to cheat on the virtues or to explicitly not be virtuous? Is it an issue that they're just ignorant, like they don't know any better? Or is it an issue of, consciously, let's say, denying reality?
Well, I mean, there's no universal answer to that, but if they really don't know better, they're not violating the virtues in the relevant sense, not in a morally blameworthy sense. That is because the virtue, according to objectivism, is rationality. Like that, you can't be held morally culpable or morally responsible for anything that you weren't in a position to do or weren't in a position to know. That is, if you're really trying to understand things and do the best given your level of knowledge, and you're trying to expand your knowledge, including your knowledge of morality, that's what morality requires from you. It doesn't require omniscience. It doesn't require the impossible. So that we can kind of set aside. It can't mean that, like, a person who's just never heard of objectivism and doesn't get that, some complicated moral issue from the objectivist perspective is true. Like there's nothing blameworthy. Now, a lot of moral knowledge, and including a lot of moral knowledge that objectivism agrees with, almost every grown adult is in a position to know. The fact that, like, honesty is a virtue. This is not like some great insight of Ayn Rand's, though she was profound in her understanding of what exactly honesty is, why it's virtuous, and how it applies in more complicated cases. But, like, you don't need to sit through an ethics class to know, like, it's wrong to cheat on your wife or husband, right? Like that's, that, and so there, it's not an issue of like a psychological cause, but what you can say is that universally what's involved is deliberately turning away from reality. Ayn Rand called this evasion, and you can explain evasion in a sense, in the sense that it's a person's rebellion against effort, or it's a desire to put their wishes above reality. But you can't explain why a person would do that. Like, that is ultimately a free will choice. But the motive is always that, like, you want to get away with something that reason won't permit you, and so that's what Ayn Rand would put as the motive of immorality. She, in Galt's speech, she will often put it as the "I wish" over the "it is."
Right. So now getting into some concrete examples, um, how do you apply the objectivist virtues? And I say virtues in the plural as considering the seven, so rationality plus the applications. So how do you apply the virtues in your work, and perhaps even personal life? But
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a hard question to answer, right? Because this, pardon me, the virtues, the virtues are carving out a way of life that is, in contemporary and conventional discussions of ethics, like, ethics comes up in, a situation where, hey, there's a, train coming down the track, and you could send it one way or the other. You could throw a fat guy over a bridge to stop the train from hitting them. What should you do? Well, in that case, like, that's completely alien from life as we actually live it. And but in the objectivist view, the virtues are characterizing a way of life, which means that in effect they're omnipresent. Now, that doesn't mean that every moment of your life you're going through saying, like, what does the virtues require? What do the virtues require? Part of what happens is that you construct your life in such a way that you make the virtues second nature. In Aristotle's way of saying it, that like you internalize a certain kind of way of acting, and that you make certain choices that are uh, long-standing and enduring, that reflect kind of a choice made out of virtue. So, for instance, like, what am I going to do today? Well, I'm going to get up and go to work. And like I built my life around my work. So it's not that I have to remind myself productiveness is a virtue, productiveness is a virtue. It's that I want to build a life around productiveness. And so I have commitments and habits and so on, all designed around having a productive career. But and so in that sense, even when we're not consciously thinking about like what does the virtues require of me, they should be the infrastructure of your life. But that said, I do think that if you are not regularly thinking about like what the virtues demand of me, that should be a real red flag, because these kinds of issues come up constantly. So if you take the workspace, um, we always dealing with people. And when you deal with people, there's often going to be conflicts. And if not conflicts, at least questions, right? So I'm giving a presentation. I was working on the project with a team, but I really did all the work. Like, should I, claim credit for it? Should I give the credit to my boss? What happens if another teammate starts taking credit for something they didn't do? What's the right answer to that? And you can't think about an issue like that absent the virtue of justice. Now, I think there's other considerations, but what role should, like, for instance, well, hey, like, if my boss hogs the credit and I call him on it, I could lose my job. That's part of what makes life tricky. But unless you have the framework of what's right here, then you can't. Then it just becomes a kind of deuces wild game of, well, there's this consideration, this consideration, this consideration. In effect, the only choice at that point is to kind of go by the seat of your pants, go by your feelings. And so you need a kind of enduring framework of virtue to kind of sort through it. Or even the, question of like, what kind of job am I going to take? What should a career be aimed at? So in Ayn Rand's book, The Fountainhead, the two of the major characters are this guy, Peter Keating and Howard Rourke. Now, they're both, on the face of it, productive. They both are architects. Peter Keating indeed does gobs of business. He's the toast of the town. He's putting up buildings. He's putting up more buildings than Rourke is. But is that what it means to be productive? And what the virtues help you get is that, no, to be productive is to create values by my own effort and live by the work of my own mind. And what we get with Peter Keating is that he does not at all live by the work of his own mind, that he's purely imitating and not actually thinking first-handedly about, like, what is an architect? What is an architect trying to achieve? What is good architecture? And so that he's not actually being productive, even if he's doing something that's economically in demand and marketable. And as a result, he's not actually happy and satisfied with his career in a way that a Howard Rourke is. And so, I don't think most people who studied Ayn Rand and agree with her would make that kind of error. But what about when you face a certain kind of question about, well, I could take this job and it has a lot of security. It's prestigious. It pays really well. How do I bounce that against this other opportunity that's high risk, but is really aligned with what I want to do with my life? And it becomes really easy in that kind of context, since you're kind of guessing, to rationalize and sweep aside this idea of I really would like this other thing better, and kind of convince yourself that, like, no, I'm going to take the safe choice and so on. And the virtue of productiveness helps you, I think, maintain an awareness of like, I really need to take seriously as best I can, like, is this career going to be genuinely satisfying to me? And only once I have that kind of clarity can I start taking into account, lesser factors like how secure is it or something like that. It helps you get to the fundamental. And that's how I think about the virtues in general. They're not always going to give you the full answer to every question where they're relevant, but they'll give you a fundamental and orient you in a way that will keep you from being sort of like helpless and confused on a crucial issue.
Right. So let me ask you, this is a little bit more on the personal side, on the parenting side. So you have
Uh-huh.
2 kids, and I have a 2-year-old. So what's your approach to, let's say, teaching your children the virtues? Or instead of, let's say, teaching, but showing them uh, the virtues? Because you don't get a whiteboard, and, it's more a practical thing.
Well, that's really worth pointing out. And I think you're right about that. I mean, my kids are just about to turn 9 and 7, and I'm of the view that the worst thing you can do is lecture a child on philosophy. But on the other hand, you want to cultivate certain virtues. And I don't want to say too much about this because I really don't feel like I'm any kind of authority on parenting. But I would say, just in general, uh, there is, look, the whole essence of, I think, raising a child um, developmentally is that you want to help them form strong values. And usually raising kids is thought of like, okay, how do we stop a kid from being selfish and think of others? Like that's like most people view that as the basic problem to be solved. And really, I think the way I think about it is much more, no, the problem to be solved is how do you cultivate their mind and allow them to think about their values in a more conceptual, long range way. And I mean, there's a lot to say about that. And I would really refer people to like Matt Bateman and Lisa Van Dam and Kyle Steele, who are all objectivist experts on this, and Ray Gurn as well, among many others who I think have a lot more to say. But the way I view it is much more um, like, what are the things I'm encouraging and what are the things I'm discouraging? Like, it's for me, it's really that simple. And I'm going to encourage by kind of like, I'll just give one example. If I want my kids to fall in love with knowledge, I want the environment that they're raised in to be conducive to the exploration of knowledge. So like our house is basically a library, not just of my books, but of children's books. My wife is a big fan of children's literature. Indeed, she's really the one you should ask this to because she used to work at Van Dam Academy and is much more of an educational specialist than I am. But I think having that environment where there's rational values at the ready to be found is at least one really important component of encouraging and cultivating the virtues.
Right. So going back to the discussion on the ARI, OAC, and the Ayn Rand University. So now, ARI is making this big change in the scope of the OAC in terms of intellectual training that it provides. So how do you think the Ayn Rand University will contribute to training a new generation of intellectuals?
Well, I mean, we're in the process of kind of figuring that out in its details. But what I will say is, ARI has a decades-long track record of successfully helping people understand objectivism and communicate objectivism at the highest levels. That is, if you make a list of all the best intellectuals in objectivism, those who didn't teach at the OAC almost certainly had some experience and gained some benefit from ARI's training over the years. And so what we want to do is really take that base and triple down on it and expand it in every respect so that we have far more impact going forward. And there's a couple ways to think about this. So one is just in terms of what kinds of training are we offering? That historically the classes have focused on like, here's objectivism and the objectivist methodology, and here's how to communicate it. But a big part of mastering objectivism and getting the value from objectivism and a lot of the difficulties with objectivism really come from application. That is, philosophic knowledge is really valuable, but most of the value comes from applying it to different fields, to different issues, culturally, personally. And so, for instance, we're going to have classes that are going to present things like science and law and literature through the lens of objectivism, so that students will get that knowledge and they'll learn a lot about philosophy in the way that objectivism approaches these kinds of issues. And so that's kind of one scale, is at the level of curriculum. A second scale, now this is something we've always done, or at least for a long time have done, but now we're doing it, I think, more self-consciously and deliberately, which is that there's been historically a focus on this is training for future intellectuals. And not everybody who went through it was committed to or eventually became an intellectual. But now I think we've widened it deliberately to what Tal Safani, our CEO, calls professional intellectuals and intellectual professionals. Now, an intellectual professional is not just somebody who likes philosophy in their free time. It's somebody who really takes ideas seriously and I think intends to be an advocate for ideas in the sphere of their work. I mean, I think a kind of clear cut idea of this is somebody like Ray Gurn, whose Montessori schools are really helping revolutionize education. It doesn't have to be that you start a company that has a kind of intellectual ambition, but it's that you are going to be a voice for your ideas, not just kind of silently hold them. But I think that kind of expansion of who we're trying to reach and what kind of people can be influential. And indeed, I think ultimately the vision is that every person who wants to be able to live a rational life and benefit from objectivism will, like, it should be a no-brainer that they're going to go through here because they'll get the kind of education they were supposed to be offered in college but weren't. I think that's the longest range version of it, where it in effect can replace what universities were supposed to offer to some degree and in some respects. But the third then, and this is most relevant to what I do, is what you can call personalization of education. So I'm heading up a counseling program, and the way to think about it is that my job is to regularly meet with students one-on-one and basically help them get the most out of their time in the OAC and achieve the most success in their life and careers. And so, you might be familiar with kind of coaching. People will hire coaches for business and life coaches and things like that. I think there's a lot of similarity with that. And the basic view here is that there's nothing more valuable when you're learning, as we talked about, than feedback. And the more personal the feedback is, and the more that the person giving it really knows you and your goals and has helped you formulating and pursue those goals, then like there's no educational experience that can be more powerful. So when we combine, the best curriculum for understanding objectivism and using objectivism to understand the world with some of the best teachers for ambitious students who are going to bring ideas into the culture, and then we personalize it with a coach who's helping them get the most out of the Ayn Rand University and get the most out of their careers and get the most out of life. I mean, to me, like, this is, we're basically like, I bought this house and have been living in it for about a week now. This is better than somebody handing you a brand new house filled with all the items you want, right? Like, this is the ultimate toolkit for life and success and happiness that I think anybody's ever tried to design. And I think it's really thrilling. And I'm usually skeptical of kind of big, bold undertakings like this. It's very easy to fail. But I've just been so impressed with how Tal was thinking about and approaching the issue, and how the whole team at ARI was executing it, that, when I had the chance to come be a part of it, I mean, there was no question that, like, yeah, this is how I want to spend the foreseeable part of my life, on really realizing this kind of vision.
Right. I mean, one of the intellectuals that is going through the OAC is Mark Moses, who was the first guest in our podcast. And he recently released a book called The Municipal Financial Crisis. And we know you helped him a little bit in terms of writing and editing. So we asked him his take on having you as a advisor, let's say. And I'd like to know your take as someone who had the experience of writing the books and so on. And so now you were in the role of, say, coaching or advising someone else's book. So what was that experience like?
Oh, well, you'll have to send me the link to Mark's thing so I can go see what he said. Um, well, I mean, so I have always liked mentoring, coaching, and editing people. But that really became clear to me in the last 4 or 5 years, where I started to realize like that is actually my favorite activity, even more than writing in many ways, is helping other people who share my ideas and values succeed, and kind of like this is the coolest career that you could have, to just get to talk about philosophy all day, like to get to like write and speak and be, doing something in the realm of ideas. And I've benefited so much from the mentors I've been lucky enough to have, that that really became a passion of mine. And so most of what I've been doing for the last 2 years had been this kind of coaching and mentoring. And Mark, it the best way to explain it is the best kind of student is somebody who has a lot of capability and just needs that help harnessing it. So I talked about that kind of line in the sand between having like less and more control over your writing. Mark was somebody who had a ton of concrete knowledge, knew a lot about philosophy, but still hadn't developed that kind of control over his writing, though he had a really high baseline of being able to string clear sentences together. And so a lot of it was just teaching him what I had to learn writing my first book, which is how do you write a book? How do you organize things? How do you present them clearly? And he was an ideal student in this sense. And this is worth saying, not just because it praises Mark, but I think it's useful to people. If you want to get mentors, if you want people to want to coach you and want to give you advice, here is a really good model to follow, which is that like he really listened. He wanted to hear the feedback. He wanted to hear critical feedback. Nobody likes it, but he wasn't defensive, and like, he was eager to hear, how can I get better? And then when I would give feedback and advice, he'd execute on it. He'd try it. He'd put it into action, and then he'd tell me like, here's the results. Here's what worked. Here's what didn't. And you could ask for nothing more from somebody that you're working with when you're in a mentorship or coaching position than that kind of like somebody committed to learning and committed to taking action. And that just enormously impressed me. And so I was super excited, though not that surprised, when Mark finally got a major publisher for his book. And it's on my shelf back here right now. And I think it turned out really well. And I think he's going to be able to do a lot of really cool stuff in the realm of ideas. But that's always the key, is if you want to get better and if you want people to want to work with you, all it takes is being eager to learn and putting in the work.
Right. So my last question is, what advice I mean, I'm young, I'm 27, and this is a little bit maybe directed to myself. So what advice do you have for aspiring intellectuals?
Well, so much of it is going to be individualized. And indeed, that's the reason why we wanted to establish the counseling program at Ayn Rand University. But there are a few general things that I'll say, and feel free to follow up. I think we have some time with anything particular to you. I mean, you got me here. But just as a few universal things, one thing I'll say is there's never been more opportunity for aspiring intellectuals if you're good. And good goes back to what I said about productivity. It's that you're able to actually create value by helping people solve the problems they want to solve through the realm of ideas. And so what you want to do is you want to become really good as quickly as possible, and keep your ear to the ground for what problems people are actually looking to solve that you can be helpful with. And like, in terms of getting really good, Ayn Rand University is a no-brainer. We talked about that. But the two other things I'll say is become really interested in non-objectivist ideas. That is, I think, a huge limiting factor in a lot of people's growth is that they become really interested in Ayn Rand, and then they only want to study Ayn Rand. And if they do read anything else, it's with a contemptuous, I know this is wrong, and I'm just looking for ways to prove that it's wrong and dismiss it. And if you want to be successful in the realm of idea, like that's fine if you're just going to be a businessman and like you're just trying to live your life, whatever. But if you actually want to do something in the realm of ideas, you have to view other thinkers as problems to be solved and sources of insight. And that means even the worst thinkers, it's not like, oh, there's some good in everybody, but it's that there's something to be learned from everybody. And from any, serious thinker, no matter how bad, there's real insight that you can gain from trying to unlock the puzzle of like, what is their view? What is their argument? Why would they think about things that way? Why are they conceptualizing things that way? Is that the right way to conceptualize it? Why do I come at it a different way? And then, so it's thinking of them as like puzzles to be solved rather than villains to be fought, or at least not purely villains to be fought. There are definitely villains out there who need to be fought. And then the final thing I'll suggest is start creating now. That is, people often have this idea of like, all right, well, I'm going to go out, become an expert, and then people will listen to me and I can do good work. But you learn so much from creating. Now, if you don't want to do it in public, that's fine. Just write papers for yourself all day. But I really benefited from writing in public from the time I was a teenager. Like I mentioned, I was writing on internet boards. I was writing on my blog and everything. But that constantly trying to put ideas into my own words, make them interesting, work through issues I was confused about, like that really added up. And part of what it will do is at first nobody will pay attention except maybe one or two of your friends. Over time, though, as you get better, you'll start to build an audience. And the sooner you start building an audience, the better, because the number one asset you can have as somebody who wants to like make a living as an intellectual, the number one asset you can have today is a following. That's going to put food on your table. And so, if I had been like building an email list from the time I was 15, it'd probably be 100,000 people by now, just who I would have collected over the years in various ways. And, with that, like you can do really, really, really well. And I've done really well with a lot less. So yeah, my view is like the best way to learn and build a career for yourself is like just start creating now and be okay with the fact that in 5 years you'll look back and go, oh my gosh, I can't believe I said that in public. But yeah, that's my basic advice. But feel free if you have any specific thoughts or areas that you'd like to talk about.
No, yeah, that was pretty good. That was pretty good. So we appreciate you coming on. Do you have any final thoughts you want to share? Yeah, I'll leave it open, let's say.
Well, look, I've given my sales pitch. I've given kind of my big picture advice. But I think I mentioned kind of writing in public, but like, look, what you guys are doing is, I think, really, a perfect example of it, right? It's what's a great way to learn? What's a great way to build your network and find mentors? Well, let me just interview a bunch of them. Like, let me, share what they know, and I can ask my questions and things like that. And then you guys are doing something additional, which is bringing it to a whole new audience that I would never get to reach on my own. And indeed, I actually think there's a lot of opportunity. Maybe someday the Ayn Rand University should teach languages, because I think there's a lot of upside for us being able to engage with and impact other parts of the world. So I have a lot of admiration for what you're doing, and are eager to see you guys keep it up.